Good morning, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the keynote speak from Tracy. For our next talk, we have Alan and Mehmet from F-Secure. They're going to have a talk called Flying by the Seat of Your Pants. And they're going to provide an overview of real-life examples of incident response investigation. I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Hello and welcome to Incident Response, otherwise known as Flying by the Seat of Your Pants. My name is Alan Melia. I'm a Principal Investigator with F-Secure and I'm joined by my colleague Mert. A little bit about me. I bought my first computer, which you can see there on the left, ZX81. So that kind of gives you an idea of my age. And it was half a week's wages at the time. That kind of got me into computing and in a small way, and I was fortunate enough to move into mainframe operations for quite a number of years and then systems programming. From there, I joined Microsoft for my sins, where I was at for 14 years. That's a brief potted history of me, but I will leave Mert to introduce himself.
Hi, hello everyone. So I'm one of the senior investigators at F-Secure. As you can see, I do have a middle name, which is Mert, which I usually like to go by. And I wanted to kind of give us a little bit of interesting information. I don't know if it's true in other countries, but in Turkey, where I'm from, if you bought a newspaper as a, it would come with coupons or like these little packets that you see. And every day for a month, if you get the whole thing, you would get a whole full set. So that was one of my things when I was a child. I would just go buy newspapers as much as possible, buy these Legos, and that got me into engineering. Yeah, engineering looked a little stressful after uni, so I was like, okay, maybe I'll go IT. Looks a bit more fun. The interviews looked a lot more entertaining. And then I eventually ended up in cyber, which is, as we all know, it's a bliss and there's no stress involved at all. And from there, I started initially with malware analysis, going into memory analysis, and ended up in incident response around 2017, and been doing incident response ever since. I've left my Twitter handle down there if you want to reach out. If you have any questions you want to ask on the side, always can do so. I'll pass it back to Alan, who can now continue with our presentation.
Thanks, Mert. I thought I would just give a gentle reminder to those who are incident responders and those who are new to the field. The incident response is based around a sequence of processes which are outlined here. Pretty much every major incident response firm has their own version of this. This is ours. The basic approach is the same for all cases. However, we like to help clients by making them ensure that they have playbooks so they can deal with the more commodity events that tend to happen, the incidents that happen fairly regularly, unfortunately, because of the world we live in. However, there comes a point when no matter how much you test, how much you run playbooks, you encounter situations that are of the unusual. And this is the place where Mert and I live, which is the world of the unexpected. In all of these cases, the client is looking for really just the answer to three basic questions, which is how did it happen? When did it happen? And what do I do next? And do I need to make any notifications? So those are the common questions that we tend to get raised for all cases. In order to do the investigation and answer those questions, what we need to start thinking about is how we conduct that investigation. So we're looking at collecting a large amount of data from a number of locations and places, typically hosts, the machines on the network itself, and any log data for applications or systems which may be related to the incident. And what we're looking to do to help answer the questions for the client, is answer those kind of high level questions. So, do we have an idea of all the infected hosts? Can we find out how we got in? Has any data been lost? And what recommendations does that indicate that the client might need to change behaviors? In order to do any investigation, our first task is to actually collect the evidence. Collecting the evidence is actually quite straightforward if the client has an endpoint detection tool of some kind. We have our own F-Secure counterset is our own tooling, EDR tooling, and obviously we're familiar with that. But during an investigation, we actually use whatever is in use at the client. The purpose of this is to allow us to cast the net out as widely as possible, gather as much information about the state of the estate and what is currently running within the estate. From that high volume of data, we're then looking at low frequency anomalies, the things that only occur once or twice. That's the typical way to do it. And once we've started narrowing that funnel, as I indicated before, we start to identify hosts of interest, and we start to eliminate things that are not relevant to the investigation. This becomes more difficult within large estates, especially with advanced threat actors, because what you will find is the administrator accounts are often used by both the administrators within the organization as well as the threat actors within the estate, which makes our job a little bit harder. But essentially, we're looking at a very simple request response process that all investigators do, which is we have a number of questions. What processes are running? Does file X exist on such a place? Is there a network connection? Those kind of things. So those are the fundamental questions that we're trying to answer. And we're working out ways in order to retrieve the information to allow it to answer those questions. So we formulate a question, we work out how we're going to send the request and get the response back. So we can get a list of processes, we can find out whether the file exists or not. At its heart, that is the basic principle on which we work. So now I've given us a little bit of a background. Let's encounter one of our cases. So this is a few years ago. We had a client who had experienced a large fraud, several million across a series of weeks. And their estate was over 40,000 endpoints across multiple countries, and there was no EDR solution. The malware itself was polymorphic, so it kept changing, and it had different features every time it ran. So we weren't able to get a consistent malware signature for it. So the first question we have to answer is, well, initially, how many infected hosts are there? To do that, in this case, what we did was we had a look at what capabilities were in the estates that allowed us to retrieve information. So for sending out the request element, we had Microsoft System Center. That's only one part of the story. To get the response back, we then figured out we could use the managed antivirus solution. So what we came up with was a solution that used System Center to send out the request, but we got the return result through the managed antivirus through a custom rule set. How that worked in detail was we created a single line batch file. This is a demonstration of that batch file in operation. So what we were looking for is a single registry key. What we found, although the malware was changing all the time for each iteration and evolving as we went, the one consistent feature that it had was whenever it created a service key, it created a security subkey in which it stored some data. And what I've done here is I've created a similar kind of feature called Alan's really bad malware with that security subkey to demonstrate this capability. So what we had was a script that looked through all of the registry hives looking for the security subkey. Now that was only present for this particular malware. So that was our unique signature for this point. What this batch file does, as you can see, is it simply prints out a message to say we found the really bad malware. In the live situation, what we, rather than produce an echo and produce a message on the screen, we created a file in a known location within the target. That matched a rule, the custom rule that we had created in the antivirus, so we were able to close the loop. SCCM sent the batch file out. The batch file created a individual file. The file triggered an AV alert, which we could then use to identify. So from 40,000 endpoints, we're able to identify 120 machines that were infected with this particular variant. And that was our next step in the chain. That's one example of the kind of creative mechanisms that we have to get into with all of our cases. But one of the things that is clear with all cases is we have to be able to generate a consistent amount of data for all cases. What we're trying to do is essentially a poor man's EDR. It is not a continuous monitoring. It is simply a way of collecting a large amount of data. We have done this for a number of years in a number of various guises. And one of the problems that really brought this to light was a client that came to us with 400 Exchange servers just after the Microsoft Alert came out with the Hafnium targeting Exchange servers. Whilst it wasn't the Hafnium group, because of course, whenever you make any vulnerability public, there's then a field day within the threat actor communities and all the various bad guys in order to try and exploit it for their own ends. This particular client was a service provider and they had a very small IT staff with limited skill sets, and they just needed help going through and trying to identify which of the machines that they had were infected. They decided to narrow it down to around 20 key Exchange servers for 20 key clients. So what we had to do was come up with a solution by which we could scan those 20 key Exchange servers. We couldn't use traditional forensics. It's simply impractical at that scale. One or two machines, fair enough, but when you start to get to the scale of 20 plus machines for full forensics, it is both impractical and not cost effective. So what we came up with was a reincarnation of an old tool of mine, which is similar to Cape and Redline, and I'll come into that in more detail, which has been called F-Secure Lightweight Acquisition for Incident Response, or FLAIR for short. Its output is in plain text and does not contain any proprietary code, but I'll come into that in the next slide. It will be published on GitHub, and we'll come to details of that at the end of this material. Talking about FLAIR, so FLAIR itself was designed based on our experience on three really key factors. The first one is, as far as possible, we don't use any external programs, or that is only using programs that reside on the operating system in target. Within the threat community, this is called living off the land. You know, it's the kind of thing that we have to do in these situations. The other element is, well, where we can't get the information that is useful from the built-in programs, we will only use Microsoft signed executables to reduce the impact on the collection. So these are things from the resource kits, these are things from the development tools, and debugging tools that allow us to get access to information that is not natively available within the OS without some programming. And we wanted to avoid creating any program that required compilation or specific targeting for in any complicated way. The third and final thing is a batch file operation. This gives us maximum compatibility across all of the Windows operating system variants. Now, it is very useful for us is that this will actually run on every version of Windows from Windows NT4 all the way up to version 20H1 and ongoing, and we make continual changes to it. We're also looking at doing minimum dependencies. So whilst we run from all of those OS versions, we still build in detection for things that are unique to particular versions. So some of the commands work on other versions, some of the commands are slightly changed between operating system versions. So wherever possible, there's that degree of, excuse me, detection included to allow for that maximum compatibility. What do we collect? As with many of the third-party tools, we're looking for process, network, file system, and other stuff. So we're trying to find out all of the key information that you would gather with an EDR tooling. So processes that are running, drivers that are loaded, DLLs that are loaded, network, firewall configuration, file system information, registry, WMI, all of the good stuff that we find is useful to an investigation. And the tool continually evolves. It's never stayed the same between cases, because we take what we learn from one case and we feed that back into the next. And that's how things have developed. And also with new releases of Windows, new tooling becomes available in different versions of Windows with the new releases that provide us access to material that is useful to an investigation. So it's an ongoing process. In terms of running it, we look to make it as simple as possible for the client. Many of the collection tools become a little unwieldy because there are a number of various options to use. And one of the things that we wanted to be sure that we were doing with our collection processes is making it as straightforward as possible. Bear in mind, for the case that we're talking about here, the IT team were very inexperienced. So what we didn't want to do is become a part of the problem. We wanted to make the collection process as simple as was practicable so that we could get the information as quickly as possible. So it runs from either a USB key or map network drive. Obviously, map network drives are relatively straightforward to implement in most environments. Failing that, in some situations, especially in secure environments, it means we can literally have somebody walking around with a USB key or a collection of people with a USB key collecting this data. And we've had to do that on some occasions for various situations. It runs typically in 20 minutes and produces a single CAD file, anything between 10 and about 150 meg in size. It varies depending upon the data that we're collecting. You'll notice that during its execution, the console window, because it is a batch file that runs in a console window, the window color changes from the normal black and white to a yellow text on a red background. That makes it easier for the operators to see when it is running. And with the best will in the world, because we're using built-in commands, sometimes there are changes in versions that creep in that we don't really are familiar with, or even locale variants. As far as is possible, it is locale independent, so we're not worried about running on French, German, Italian, or whatever language base we have on there, because the batch file itself is, as far as is possible, language agnostic as well as tool agnostic. Once it's finished, we create a batch, a cab file. Now, this is all done with built-in tools that are built into every version of Windows from NT4 onwards. And as you can see, the window color changes to yellow. This is also a visual cue for the operators so that they know when it's completed. So there we go. We've got the process running. We collect all of the data. Then what do we do with it? Well, as you may remember, I mentioned that the collection tool does, as far as possible, make the data available in plain text format. The obvious and easiest solution for us that we've put together is Elastic Logstash and Kibana. So we basically use Elasticsearch to ingest the output from these collections. That allows us to do the anomaly detection across multiple collections, as well as the looking for commonalities in terms of IOCs across all of these collections. That's something we use for larger instances where we have typically more than about 20 hosts to deal with. If you're dealing with up to 100 or so hosts, you need to be able to look at the data in volume. So this is where Elasticsearch comes in really useful. At its basic level, you can actually use Yara rules, and I do that very frequently with the data that we get back. Is look through, you create a Yara rule for the things that I'm looking for that I think should be there. Once I understand them, you could do a basic grep search across them. That's always a very common and easy thing to do. But the first thing I always do is actually just eyeball the data. So I like to walk through the data. I'm after 14 years at Microsoft, I'm reasonably familiar with what should be in a Windows environment. So I like to have a look through and just see what is going on. That's Flare in a description. So let's get back to the problem we started with. So we had 20 Exchange servers that the client believed were at risk. They were right. From the analysis, we were able to show that all of the hosts had signs of exploit abuse. So that is probing from the internet, trying to make use of the exploit, the test proxy exploit in the Exchange server. From those 20 servers, only 4 of them had actually resulted in a web shell being dropped onto the Exchange server. And of those 4, only 1 of them showed any signs of that web shell actually being used for malicious activity. And that resulted in the LSAS, or the security subsystem, being dumped, which required further remedial action. So from the 20 key Exchange servers from the client, what this meant was we could get them an analysis within a couple of hours of receiving the data. And because we were doing this repeatedly, we were able to establish a degree of automation to go through the data to reduce the time to result. So we didn't have to wait, at least typically a day for processing a forensic image. We could do this within a couple of hours initially, and once we understood the way that the exploit was being used, we could then go through and automate the process. It made it cheaper for the clients, so we weren't spending as much time on the case. It was more cost effective for the analysis. We didn't have to devote as much time to each of these machines for the analysis. And I say with the automation, it simplified the approach and scaled really, really well. However, that's where we were with the Windows estate. But as you know, there's a lot of the world that isn't Windows, is it, Mert?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about mixed systems now. Like when it comes to Windows environments, we have EDR agents available. However, as the code needs to be compiled for each version of the operating system, the latest version, most EDR solutions are available for the latest releases of OSs, which means in most cases when you need to deploy EDR, it's just not available for the versions that client might have. So it's not always possible. Let's say you wanted to create a triage tool, binaries needs to be compiled on the hosts to be run on that specific host, like just like memory collection, as most of the IR professional knows in Linux, it is difficult to collect. You need to profile it on the device, and what this makes what this creates is a problem that, like, how do you collect consistently data from Linux systems in Nix systems? And another thing about Nix systems is that times and times we've seen like little systems that were forgotten in parts of the network, and the attacker came back later on to use these systems as they had gained persistence early on. And in some cases, the clients were not even aware that they had a Nix box that had the root password as root 1234, and it was just sitting at the side of the network unforgotten. And also when it comes to the Nix systems, disk image is not always ideal. Windows provides a lot of historical artifacts, while Nix systems are a little lacking in this perspective. And again, coming to the idea that some clients will want to know the code running. What code are you running on this environment? And you might need to make modification as part of your IR cases. Now, if you build a complicated tool, it becomes a challenge for like the developer of the tool being available all the time and make the modifications. But by making a simple tool that anyone with the bash knowledge available, you can actually make the tool available to be modified on demand by any person who has some basic IT skills. Next slide, please, Alan. So let's look at a problem. So we had a client come in. They were a managed service provider. They had about 600 hosts. Half of the estate was Windows, half of it was Linux, mostly CentOS with some exceptions. But they said to us, hey, we had a cryptocurrency incident about a month ago. We believe it started at the Windows environment. We think we contained it, but we believe there are remnants that are affecting our logging in the environment. Now, we obviously, like the impression we got from the client is like the threat actor may still be in, and there is very minimal logging and visibility of the environment. So we decided to deploy a plan where we deploy EDR on the Windows estate, which can be pretty standard for most incident response. But there was a massive 300 host Linux estate, and this is where we deployed a tool called CatScale, which I'm going to dive into now. Just to give a perspective of the incident, on the first 3 days of deployment of the EDR on the Windows estate, we found 70% of the Windows estate was compromised. 2 active persistent threat actors, one Asia-based, one Eastern Europe-based, was active. An Eastern European threat actor was actually busy extracting data. So we had to hit ground running fast. Now, within the first 3 days, we have like massive questions, right? So is the infection in the Linux estate linked to the Windows? Where is the entry point? Is it Linux? Is it Windows estate? Could it be another actor on the Linux estate? How compromised is the Linux estate even? So the tool we have utilized is, let's go to the next slide, is CatScale. So CatScale is a bash script, uses system binaries. So again, this idea comes from like the tool being simple and being able to run it by, any IT staff should be able to easily run it. And the output is consistent, so we can actually ingest it into a system or perform analysis at scale. Because triaging 300 hosts one by one, that's going to take about 900 hours of man work, which is insane amount. So we have to be smart when it comes to triaging massive estates, trying to get an understanding what has happened historically and what is happening now. So going back to the tool takes about 60 seconds to run. The data itself, once is archived, it's about 140 to 300 megabyte on average. And it kind of targets both what's happening on the box now and tries to collect like any forensic artifact that we know to be valid to identify historic activity. And using, again, ELK, as Alan was using, as an open source solution, just ingesting the data, which we have a log stash config for, into the ELK, and then we can in scale search for indicators of compromise across the environment, ensure, remove all the persistence items by aggregating. It definitely speeds up the analysis. We have built the tool by testing it on a specific operating system, so it does provide support currently for Ubuntu, Debian, Red Hat, Solaris, and there's the full list on the slide. So let's talk about, this is actually like the command line output for the tool. I'm just going to talk about certain aspects that was relevant to that case, but obviously it has, it's quite extensive, and it is available on GitHub, which will show the link later on, which you can go and look and have a see what it collects. But in this particular incident, we collected the whole war log folder, as you would expect. And we were actually able to determine that the threat actor was using a cloud panel host, which was in the Windows environment, to leak into the Linux environment to run commands at scale. We also, if you can click, Alan, we also collected a file timeline. Now, what this does is basically iteratively walks through every file on the system folder, gets file timestamps, owners of these folders, and the set GUDs and set UDs, and the owners of the files, as I said, their permission flags also. So with that, we can actually start looking for disk persistent, files across the environment to see indicators. Next, please. And login scripts, again, anything that we know to be favored by the threat actor's persistence items, we also collect these to identify any compromise. Next, please. And this is quite critical. If you can click again, Alan. So in this particular case, actually, what was really interesting is that the managed service provider did not have a domain. Each computer was isolated and managed on its own. Now, the client did use shared administrator password, which did not help and allow the threat actor to spread like a wildfire eventually. But the threat actor actually, once the client had changed the password, threat actor came up with a solution where they deployed web shells across almost every web server possible to be able to C2 manage the environment. Threat actor almost had better control of the Windows environment than the IT stuff, the company that owned the hardware did. So what we have in the tool here is that we have built in this functionality, luckily from the experiences with other cases, that it would identify every file that would be like potential web shell file extensions, so ASPX files, ASP files, and it would grab their hashes and it would collect their first 1,000 lines. What this allows you to do is you can essentially run a Yara scan across the whole collected data to determine where on Linux estate web shells were dropped. If you can go to the next slide. Again, just to give you an idea, let's say you wanted to use this tool on an incident, you can remove parts of it because it's all functions essentially in the code, or you can add your own functions, which are just bash commands, which you should be able to quickly Google how do you do this, and there's like endless resources available to you to modify the script to work into your IR demands. Next slide. So let's talk about the outcome. What happened? So at the end of the analysis, within essentially 1 day, we were able to identify that 22 of the Linux hosts in the estate was compromised by the Eastern European threat actor. They had compromised the estate through the cloud panel host that was hosted on the Windows estate. And this was could be analyzed through the logs, and we could see the cloud panel logs clearly showing the communication coming from that IP. We also found, interestingly enough, 2 other separate infections that were not relevant to the other threat actors we have seen, which was one active malicious persistence in one of the host's cron tubs. It was, again, a crypto miner. and another host we identified had a web shell implant that was identified through running Yara scan across the collected potential web shell files. Now, obviously working at a scale on a Linux estate doing IR, you identify some challenges with the tooling and allows you to actually test these tools, how they operate when you're running at scale across, 3 different separate hosts. And we identified like the maintaining growth filters or, adjusting them ever so little every time we collected was kind of necessary. And this case again showed like we had to actually modify it, so we were also ingesting cloud panel logs into our ELK. So it's there's definitely some thinking that we're doing to improve that part of the data. How can we ingest as much as the possible data without having to create grok filters for it? We have some ideas. We're working on that. And another thing is the time zones. So the collected data, most of the Nix systems contain everything in a text file, and the timestamps are in different formats at times. So how do you, in this particular case, the whole Linux estate was in one time zone. So it was, we knew what time zone every host was running in and what timestamps were in. But as soon as you start working on a case that has Nix systems across the world in different time zones, then that's a different challenge, and you need to we need to come up with ways to how can we monitor or maintain timestamps in a unanimous format, I guess. Well, after the incident we cleaned the incident, the threat actor was removed, we actually did deploy our Linux detection agent. We had initially had doubts about deploying it because we hadn't tested on the operating system versions the client was running, but the client was quite keen to get some visibility in there, and luckily we had no problems with deploying the detection agent in their Linux estate. And with that, just to give you guys like a final thoughts, IR incident response is not always clean cut. The clients or the incident might throw you curveballs, and you need to be able to create tools that are resilient enough to run almost in any environment, or come up with solutions what's available to you, just like Alan did with the SCCM system and the customer AV rules, just to be able to quickly triage the whole environment. Evidence collection is the common pain point in most incidents. We know that as the time goes on, the threat actors are getting faster and faster from the initial compromise to executing their objective. So we need to, one of the common pain points is the artifact evidence collection, and we need to get smarter as the IR professionals. How do we streamline this, make it as fast as possible, make it as easy as possible, so we can scope the incidents and deal with them. And taking a note from the threat actors recent years have been going to more in the direction of living off the land. And honestly, I don't see why we shouldn't do this either. There's a lot of tools available on the operating systems. Without having to introduce foreign binaries to systems, we can quickly triage and get a full picture of the estate, as the threat actors tend to do. And another key thing is the tools need to be able to scale out. If the tool output is only allowing you to effectively analyze 1 or 2 hosts, this can be good for small investigations, but as soon as you have a major investigation, suddenly you don't have the right tooling, and you need to figure out a new solution. So whenever we're creating IR tools, we need to consider scalability. How do we ensure we can analyze the data if we're analyzing thousands of hosts instead of just a couple? And last point that I want to leave with you guys is that we are stronger together. Our tools are open sourced. So if you want to, get inspired by what's in them, or contribute to them, we're totally keen. Or if you even have questions or suggestions, please reach out to us. And let's make the world a better place, I guess. With that, I believe we will be moving on to Q&A. Thank you.
Welcome everyone back. Thank you very much, Alan and Mehmet. That was a truly interesting talk. Just to remind everyone, the time for questions is open. Feel free to send your questions, and we will have Alan and Mehmet's answers. We have one on our system at the moment. What was in particular what prompted you guys to deliver this talk, to share this knowledge, and to share your experience with the rest of the community? Tell us a little bit more.
All right, I'll take that one, and maybe Mert can pick up on where I leave off. Firstly, I'd like to apologise because I really do suck at talking to camera for everybody out there. So thank you for your patience. It's a lot nicer when you're trying to do this in front of people. But getting back to the question, the reason that we're doing this is one of the problems that we encounter so frequently is that clients do not understand the way to collect data properly, and it can be a bit of a hit and miss affair. But one of the crucial elements for any investigator anywhere is collecting evidence. So what we're trying to do is to make sure that there's a more level playing field. And from making this both CAT scale and FLAIR public, we're trying to save a little bit of time and, frankly, our own sanity in having to go through this. It's an iterative process. We go through this with every client, and what we're trying to do is trying to shorten that process and give us a little bit of a head start on the data collection. Also, the fact that we're aware that we don't know everything. We often have to make changes to the collection scripts that we use, and we're open to any ideas that are out there. So we hope that people will take what we've done, maybe learn from it, and expand on it, and help us to help you. We want to make this a collaborative event. How you do the analysis, that's the secret sauce that I think all investigative teams rely on. But the data collection is a crucial and fundamental element that it goes wrong so frequently. Is there anything from a unit's point of view you want to add in on that?
No, I think you covered it very well. Whenever we have an incident come in, like one of the first conversations we have is like, okay, we'll need the data from this. Do you how? And the client comes back, how do we do this? So this is why, I think every consultant company or every IR specialist company has their collection tools. But again, sharing this tool out there with the clients, it makes sure that the evidence is collected before we're called in, and just trying to preserve as much of this evidence as possible before things can get started on our end. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much, guys. That was really good. Everyone, if you have any question, please send them across on the system, and we will ask Alan and Mehmet. Did you guys, you shared some really interesting experience and examples here. Is there anything that maybe you left out of time? Maybe we can discuss it right now. Mehmet, you were mentioning maybe some other example.
Yeah, I think one thing when it comes to IR is that we need to, as IR professionals, or when we're responding to threats, we need to be as fast as possible. So one of the examples of this is recently we had an incident in the cloud. Again, we couldn't use these tools to triage the hosts quickly enough. But what we could do was we basically mounted the snapshots of these compromised devices, multiple. I think there were about more than 20, and we could quickly, script up some bash scripts to just quickly, search for indicators across the host. When it comes to, I think, triage and full in-depth analysis, maybe this is not as clear to people who are outside the IR field. But triage is essentially to first understand the scope of the incidents, and in-depth is trying to understand the actual like as much of the actions that threat actor has done, right? So the triage, you want to do it as quick as possible just to get get ahead of the threat actor so you can contain the threat before it causes any financial impact. So again, when it comes to IR, I think what we're trying to say is do not, try to think outside the box, try to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish as fast as possible with whatever tools available to you or to your clients. I think this is why I joined F-Secure about a year ago, and this is like quite one of the things that we do is that we're trying to be agnostic to the client and to the thread to be able to triage as fast as possible and to eliminate the thread as fast as possible.
We have actually a question related exactly what you are discussing about triaging as fast as possible. We have a question from Fotis asking to you, Mehmet, in particular, how long did it take you from the initial probing of this particular incident to the containment and the final analysis in the case that you presented? And a second part of the question, do you think that smaller teams would be able to implement the tools that you shared, like ELK, Flare, CATScale for IR?
Deployment of ELK is super easy. Like there's a lot of Dockers images available and tutorials available to do this. We have provided a log stash alongside our tool. We will try to keep it up to date as much as possible and try to improve the ingestion pipeline so people can use it. So the idea of the tools are to be able to allow the small teams to use it. We are trying to implement detections in the tools also to help small IT teams just to have places to start in. Yeah, I can dive into that later if there's more questions. In terms of the incident that I've presented, that was actually about a month's effort. The Windows estate was rather badly impacted, so we managed to contain most threads within 5 days. But the Eastern European threat actor, they've been in the network for about at least 6 months as far as we could tell. And they had actually, that's a whole case actually. We prepared presentations and we've done some in closed forums. Hopefully in the upcoming months, we'll be putting out some blog posts about this threat actor. But what's interesting about this threat actor is that they had backdoors on the hosts, but they also introduced vulnerabilities to the running applications and the file system to be able to exploit and come back if they were kicked out. So with this threat actor, we will be able to execute first containment with some network changes and so on day 7. But then we had a little back and forth with the threat actor where we were trying to figure out all the backdoors they have left, or essentially the passive vulnerabilities that are introduced to specific applications, which is almost impossible to detect if you don't have historic data. Whole incident was contained about, I would say, 10 to 2 weeks time, if I remember correctly. And the in-depth investigation took another 2 weeks, but we had quite a big team, global team working on it, and analysis of the in-depth analysis of the hosts definitely took a very long time.
Thank you very much. We don't have any more questions, but there's one question from me. So when do you think it is the right time when you start from the analysis of an incident to the point where you start the containment? Obviously, the actions that you may take may alert the threat actor. So you are not investigating passively anymore. You need to make an action. When is the right moment? Do you need to understand everything of everything or not? Tell us your experience.
Absolutely. I think this is a conversation we hear a lot from our clients also. So I think there is always a talk about a striking point for a containment, but it's not really clear what is meant by this. I think there is some research or clarification needed in this area. From my perspective, I think there are a couple vectors of or swim lanes that you need to have information on to be able to move to containment. Just to give you some idea, your visibility of the environment is one of the factors. Your knowledge of the attacker's persistent methods, your knowledge of the attacker's lateral movement, and the fourth one is your knowledge of the history of the incident, the entry point. And the fourth one is the kill chain. So where is the attacker right now? Are they executing on the objective? So let's say like you know the attacker is taking out data, but you have no clue how they're laterally moving or how they have persistence, and you have no visibility. There is no point containing at this point because you will not be able to remove them. So almost you need to combine some of these to make up a sensible plan. Let's say you know how they're persisting and you know they're taking out data, then you can hamper their efforts at least somewhat to slow them down. Obviously, increasing your visibility should be critical whenever you detect an incident, because you want to understand all the indicators of compromise threat actor is using. For example, you don't know their lateral movement or you don't know their persistent methods, but if you have visibility and you know the threat actor is taking out data, then you can actually contain it and start, like, at least we call this, I think a lot of the industry calls it this whack-a-mole, but sometimes it's necessary. If you don't have the information and the threat actor is taking out your data, you have the visibility, just go for it and play that game with them for a short period till they show all their tooling to you. I don't think it's as clean cut as don't do it till you know everything. I think you need to leverage what you know and try to understand, okay, do I need to hamper their effort? So is this an hampering effort to slow them down, or is this containment? So again, containment takes a lot more, knowing lateral persistent methods and live visibility. But if they're taking out your data, you definitely need to start doing some things. Or, we sometimes tell our clients, do have a break glass policy. If things are going really bad, have a plug that you can pull out at least to ensure you stop that data flowing, or have some methods or procedures that you can deploy to stop the threat actors from leaving with your data while you cannot do anything. Alan maybe might have more opinion on this also. He has a lot more experience than I have.
Does the grey hair give it away?
Yeah, always.
I can't help but agree with Mert that what we're dealing with is a very subjective opinion. We make the best decision on the information that we have available, and the difficulty with clients is that there is no absolute. There's no definitive switch between between knowing everything and knowing nothing. There's a phased introduction. So you have to listen to the experts that you're working with and utilize their experience in dealing with events in order to make the decisions. It's the best of a bad job. That's all you can really say about all of our cases. We're never going to be 100% sure, but what we will do is to give you a degree of probability. This is where we will believe we're at from the data that we have. The more data that we have, the more accurate that analysis becomes. As Mert says, coverage is key with all of these things.
Brilliant. Thank you, guys. Thanks a lot for your presentation. That was truly interesting. So next, we have a coffee break, and we can reconvene at 11:20 when Andy Snowball will be talking to us about ransomware. Once more, thank you very much, the guys from F-Secure. That was a really cool presentation. Thanks a lot. Bye for now.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.